Hi there, I'm Dominic from Mountea, and in today's video, I would like to showcase some cool new features in Mountea Dialogue System. So let's take a look.
Let's start with the basics, which is how to add the plugin to your engine version. In the search, let's type Mountea Dialogue, and you should get our plugin as the only result. Select Install to Engine, and select any supported version. In this example, we are using version 5.4. Now we only need to await till installation has completed. Once completed, let's create new project using the Unreal Engine version you selected with the plugin installation. In this example, we will use Games Template folder and third-person example. Blueprint or C++ selection does not matter as the plugin works with both options. I would strongly suggest to select Starter Content. We have the project opened. Before we continue further, we need to enable the plugin. Let's go to Plugins, which can be found under Edit button in the toolbar. In Installed category, you can see Mountea Framework subcategory. Select it and enable Dialogue System plugin. Now select the Restart button. Now let's take a look how to find the plugin folder. In the content browser, select Engine and then Plugins and scroll to the Mountea Dialogue System. I would strongly suggest to add this folder to favorites. Favorite folders are shown in their own part of the content browser. In the Examples folder, there is a dialog example map. Open the map. If the map is pitch black, all you need to do is to go to Plugins and enable HDRI Backdrop plugin, and then restart the project again. Now you should see the map the same way it was created. If you can't see the mannequin mesh, do not panic. The solution is very straightforward. Simply select the Add button, select Add Feature or Content Pack, and select the third-person example, and add it to the project. First change in the new update is the Dialog Manager. In previous versions, we had the Dialog Manager in the player controller. If we open the player controller, you can see that the Dialog Manager component is no longer there. The Dialog Manager is now in the player state. If we open the player state, you can see the manager there. And why this change happened? Reason is replication and multiplayer support. The player state exists on all clients and we can use other players' data in our world. In the Dialog Manager, there are only two attributes that need to be filled. The first attribute is the widget class. The second one is the manager state. The widget class defines what dialog widget this manager will use. UI is not needed for the system to work. The manager state should be either disabled or enabled, as active should never be set manually. If you want the system to work in multiplayer games, you must set the component to replicate. Default values is true. The player state replication is also enabled and should be, thus multiplayer is ready to go. Now let's take a look at the dialog settings. Dialog settings are in the project settings, in the very bottom of the categories list. there are two options you can select. First one is the dialog system itself. Second one is settings for the dialog editor. Let's focus on what settings are required for the dialog system to work. Those settings are in the non-editor category. First, we need to set up the dialog widget class. That is the UI widget dialog we'll use, unless the manager overrides it with different value. The UI must implement the dialog UI interface in order to show in the selection. Input mode defines what input mode will be used during dialog. This setting is not used in the code and serves only informative purpose. Duration. Coefficient defines how long it takes to read 100 characters and is used for automatic dialog row calculation. The higher the value, the longer the dialog row is displayed. Default is 8 seconds per 100 characters. Skip row with audio. Skip will skip the whole dialog row if audio is skipped. This provides a way to skip dialog audio only. Default is false. Skip fade duration is used to fade out audio when skipping to avoid unwanted audio cut. Allow subtitles is self-explanatory, I believe. Showing or not showing subtitles. Now, let's get back to skipped commands. You will see them in action in the UI class. Those 7 values are used to easily determine what action is needed to perform in the UI. Now the most complicated part. Settings and overrides. Each setting has its own GUID, which defines unique ID for the setting. The first part is actually something you already know, and that is the text settings. Font, shadow offset, and shadow color are all settings you know from standard widget editor. However, as some parts of the dialog need to be distinguished, example might be option to leave the dialog or option to start trading, or important quest selections, we need a way to somehow highlight such option. For that, we have option of overrides. Each override has definition, which contains 2 variables, ID of the override and what widget type this override applies to. Then, you can easily specify any values you like. In this example, ID of 166 will be used with basic dialog class. We have covered basics of the settings. More in-depth overview and explanation can be found in the official documentation. Link is in the description down below the video. Now, let's take a look at how to actually create a dialog. Dialog creation is actually quite simple process. In this example, I will create new folder in the project content to contain examples used in this video. In this folder, I will create new data table. Data table is in the miscellaneous category. This will be further simplified in the next release. The data table must use dialog row structure. Let's open the data table and start filling data in. The first row will be NPC row. The editor shows dialog row data, which you can specify. As you can see, You can even override visual style per each row if you need something super specific. Dialog rows can contain gameplay tags, which are used to map dialog participant with the row he is using. The row ID is the ID which is later used to map against the project settings overrides. Optional icon can provide texture to the dialog row. For merchant, an icon of money. For closing dialog, a X icon, etc. Dialog participant defines the name of the speaker. Row title is what is displayed to the UI as selectable option. NPC rows can be left empty, as those are usually auto-played. Now, the most important one. The dialog row. Data. This is the definition of the dialog text. It contains the text itself, what is being said, as well as optional sound for voice. Remaining options define the duration of the row itself, how long it takes to finish, how is the duration calculated, etc. The same way we have created the NPC line, we can create the player option, give it a proper name, and fill the data. In this case, the row title is important to fill, as it will be shown to the player as selectable option. If we want more options, or we are feeling lazy, you can duplicate the current row and just update data which are different. In this case, it will be different answer, for example, closing the dialog option. Dialog tables can be exported as CSV or JSON files. This way, you have much finer control. Once edited in external tools, you can import dialog back again. By the way, in the link in the description, there is a sneak peek for the next big update. External tool that will allow creating dialogues outside Unreal with simple import logic to Unreal. Currently in closed alpha testing, but in a few weeks or months, ready for everyone. This has been the boring part of creating the dialogue, I know. But trust me, this is how dialogues are managed in AAA games. Data-driven approach is much better in the long term, and it provides much more manageable tools for scaling up your project. So, now the dialog tree itself. In the content browser, let's select dialog tree option and create new one. If you save, right away there will be some errors. Don't worry about it. It is just validation telling you that current dialog is not valid. It is the same as pressing the Validate Dialog button in the editor. The validation window will give you some more details. It will explain what node has what issues. If you keep the window opened and press validation again, it will close the old window and will create new one. And what does the validation say about the start node? Well, it requires at least one child node, so let's create one. We will choose LED node now, as it is what NPC nodes are. By the way, you can always press Auto Arrange button, which will beautify, or at least will try to, the graph. Select the lead node and take a look what options does it have. Most nodes will have different details panel. As you can see, the start node has fewer variable than the LED node. However, some remain, for example, the documentation button. Once pressed, it will open the documentation link on the GitHub documentation. Keep in mind that the documentation is still work in progress. The lead node, as well as all active dialog nodes, have dialog table and row selection. Let's select the table we have created and the NPC row. Pay attention please to the preview part, where data are filled once you select the dialog table and/or the row. This helps previewing the data in the editor. If you have a node selected, you can press F2 and rename the selected node. If any node has any sort of issues, it will use that name to give you clues what is going on. In the very same way we have created the NPC, we will create player response. Select the answer node, as that is the node used for player, and connect it with the lead node. Then we will add complete dialog node. If we validate the graph now, you can see that those two new nodes are not happy. Let's fix it now. We need to fill data to them, and we do it the same way we filled the NPC node. Select table and row, and then save the graph. Now once we have created our basic dialog, it is time to actually use it. The dialog is defined in the NPC, which is using that dialog. So let's select the NPC. In the NPC, select the participant component. In the component, fill the dialog with newly created graph. That is all you need to do. Let's hit play. As I get near enough, the dialog starts playing. As you can see, it is exactly what we have created in the graph. By selecting the close dialog, the dialog will close itself. So, what is the actual NPC we are using here? The NPC is in the example folder. The blueprint of the NPC is extremely basic. No code, just mesh and the participant component. The participant component is very simple for setup, as it has only 4 variables. First is the dialog itself. You can specify the dialog in the class itself, or you can specify it in the instance in the level. Last is participant tag, which is gameplay tag. which is used to map this participant with dialog row from the data table. Next is audio component ID. That is either name or tag of an audio component in the participant that is used for spawning audio of the NPC voice. If none is selected, we will try to use first audio component in the NPC. If none exists, dialog voice will be spawned at location of the NPC. This will break skipping. Lastly, it is the participant state. Same as the manager, use either enabled or disabled. With NPC done, it is time to set up the player itself. The process will be very similar. This class has only a bit of a code, and that is used to simplify starting the dialogue. Player pawn must have its own participant component. Why? Because player is participant of the dialogue too. This example player has a few helper parts you can use. The code you see is almost the same as the example third-person character code. In the begin play, we have added one extra mapping for the dialog inputs. The dialog input is in the input folder in the plugin itself. It contains only the skip mapping. Inputs are untouched, therefore those are native Unreal inputs. The tick function in this case is used for populating the debug text. I would suggest to not use tick events. This is for showcase purposes only. Lastly, there is the helper logic to trigger the dialogue, and that is done when overlapping other actors. Please, do not use this in any game. The only part you should use from this example is the inputs mapping. In the core folder, we have the player controller. That contains logic for skipping dialogue. This is using the input mapping we have already seen. Then there are helper functions that determine whether player can look or move during the dialogue. Those functions are helpful to disable movement and camera controls during dialogue. Here is how you can use them. In the core folder, we also have the player state we have already seen. This blueprint is responsible for the whole dialogue management. Component must be replicated to make multiplayer work. The same applies to the blueprint class itself. And don't worry, player state and the manager component are both set to replicate by default. There are also quite some events you can use to further expand the dialogue system yourself. And the cherry on top, we have a special sauce which makes this dialogue system unique and modular. And that is Decorators. You can choose from existing ones or create your own. You can select Decorator for the whole graph, which will execute for each dialogue node, or you can specify the decorator for a specific node. In this case, we added Decorator to toggle typewriter effect. You can enable or disable the effect globally, and it will affect all nodes in the graph. We can also add this decorator to any node and override the graph settings. Each decorator has a few buttons. We can delete the selected decorator, we can find its location, we can edit the decorator, and we can open the decorator's documentation page. Some decorators don't have the Edit and Open Location buttons. Those decorators are the ones created in C++. By default, you cannot edit or find those decorators. In the editor settings, you can enable editing of those, however, that is for intermediate users only. That is all for this update. Thank you very much for your attention. Feel free to join the support Discord, where we have very active community, and where you can ask any question or even request update to the system. See you in the next video. Bye.